Mary Rich and her family were enjoying their typical Sunday church service in 1961. However, this day would turn out to be anything but typical, because this was the day that Mary would meet a man named Ron Larrinaga. Ron appeared to be a good family man who knew the Bible backwards and forwards, and he impressed Mary from the moment she laid eyes on him. Mary thought that this man could help her and her family become closer to God. But instead of guiding Mary on a spiritual journey, Ron would spend the next 20 years torturing her and her family and imprisoning them in a cult. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime, cults, and heinous history. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing. Today we're talking about Ron Larrinaga and how he literally took over a family, multiple families actually, and turned them into what can only be described as a cult. This is a very disturbing case. Ron was an absolutely vile human being. There aren't really many photos associated with this case, and some of the victims' names that I will be using are not their real names. Many of them are pseudonyms. Most of the victims have remained anonymous, which is totally understandable. These people went through a total nightmare that lasted years, and that is what we are talking about today. But before we get into the case, let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Trade. If you're like me and your day starts with a fresh cup of coffee, then adding Trade to your life can take your coffee experience to the next level. Trade is the #1 craft coffee marketplace in the US, and they offer more than 450 coffees from more than 50 of the top roasters in the country. With just a quick quiz, Trade can match you with your ideal coffee, and if the coffee that they choose isn't the one for you, they'll replace it for free. Trade's prices are comparable to grocery store prices, but you're getting high quality craft coffees instead of the typical stuff that you would find at a grocery store. And I really love the fact that I am supporting local roasters. The coffee is always shipped to you within 48 hours of roasting, so this is roasted to order. Every bag is going to arrive fresh. We are huge coffee drinkers at my house, and we all love to try out new brands, and Trade has made it possible for us to try out coffees that we never would have even heard of. We all get so excited when we see that red Trade bag in our mailbox. Today I'm brewing this one from Cuvée out of Spicewood, Texas. This is a medium roast with notes of milk chocolate, nuts, and vanilla. Just look how beautiful this looks, and it smells amazing. So if you're like me and you love coffee and you like trying out new coffees, a Trade subscription is definitely worth it. And right now Trade is exclusively offering my viewers 40% off their first order when you go to drinktrade.com/summer. That's drinktrade, TRADE.com/summer for 40% off your first purchase. A big thank you to Trade for the continued support on this channel, and now let's get into the case. It's 1961 in San Luis Obispo, California, and 22-year-old Mary Rich and her husband Doug, along with their 2 young kids, were attending their usual Sunday church service. Mary had grown up in a loving household. Her parents would take Mary and her siblings to church occasionally, but they weren't like super religious. It wasn't something that was very central to her family. But as Mary grew up, she became very interested in religion, and she found herself wanting to learn as much about it as she could. And she knew that one day when she grew up and she had her own family, she wanted God and the church to be an important part of their lives. Mary and Doug got married when they were only 18 years old, and by the time they were 22, they had 2 children. Now, when Mary and Doug first met, he wasn't super into religion, but Mary got Doug more involved in her church, and he knew how important this was to her, and so he really tried his best to make an effort to learn more about God. And this, for the time being, was good enough for Mary. Doug was obviously making an effort. Even though she did want him to eventually get on her level, she was okay with their current situation as long as Doug was making strides towards becoming a more Christian person. Doug was attending college during the day. He was in the education program to become a teacher, and at night he would go to his job at the post office. Mary ran the house. She took care of the kids. She did all the chores, the cooking, the cleaning. She pretty much kept everything together. And they didn't make much money, but they knew that this was just temporary, and once Doug graduated, he would get a teaching job and they would have a better life. They found a church in the San Luis Obispo area that they really liked, and they attended this church every week. And Mary was really happy during this time. You know, she had her little family and everything was just kind of falling into place. But unfortunately, it was that day in 1961 when Mary and her family were attending that Sunday church service that she first laid eyes on an absolutely disgusting, evil human being named Ron Larrinaga. As Mary and Doug and their 2 kids, Cinda and Daniel, sat in church that day, Mary noticed a family that was sitting not far from them. And as she's listening to the sermon, she's finding herself glancing over at this family. The dad was skimming through his Bible, and his wife and kids sat quietly next to him. And what really impressed Mary about this family, like what really caught her eye, was how well behaved the kids were. This particular church that they were attending didn't offer a daycare, and so the kids, no matter how young, they were expected to sit quietly during these super long church sermons. And that is something that Mary and Doug had a tough time with because their kids, like most kids, could not sit still for that long, and so they would start to get restless after a while. But this family had several kids, and they were all very well behaved, and this really impressed Mary. And so after the church service was over, Mary and Doug decided to introduce themselves to this family, and this would turn out to be a huge mistake that would have devastating, life-altering consequences. So Mary and her family walk outside after the church service was over, and they spot this man, Ron Larrinaga, and his family standing on the front lawn of the church. And Ron was basically preaching to some of the other church members. There was like a little crowd around him, and he was giving his own little sermon right there on the front lawn. Ron could quote scriptures from memory like no one had ever seen, and he was speaking like a preacher would speak. The other members, they were impressed, especially Mary. And literally, as soon as Ron started talking to Mary and Doug, Mary was completely captivated. She felt very drawn to Ron in a spiritual way. However, Doug did not feel drawn to Ron at all. In fact, he kind of found him arrogant. But Mary really believed that Ron might be the answer to their problems, that Ron could be the one to teach Doug more about God and also teach her some things. So they invited Ron and his family over for lunch one day, and it was all downhill from there. Things were weird right from the start during this lunch. Ron would not let his family out of his sight. He would not let his kids go outside and play with Mary's kids. They had to just sit on the ground at Ron's feet the entire time they were there. Mary's kids were like running all around trying to get his kids to get up and play, but they just sat quietly at Ron's feet. They didn't speak unless they were spoken to. They didn't move. They were just kind of there. And this really should have been a major red flag for Mary. Like, why are these young kids so subdued? Why did they not even speak to each other? But to Mary, she thought that these were just really well-behaved kids, and so she didn't really question why they were behaving this way. And Ron's wife, Dorothy, behaved pretty much the exact same way. She was very quiet, very subdued, and Ron did all of the talking. And dear God, did he keep talking. He would not shut up. He spoke about his upbringing and how he found God. He would also just launch into scriptures and interpretations. This man spoke all through lunch and into the night. Doug was 100% right with his first impression of Ron. He was arrogant and he loved the sound of his own voice. And he also didn't mind talking about some pretty messed up stuff in front of his kids. He was telling Mary all about his childhood, and it was horrific. Ron claimed that his mother and father split up when he was only 3, and his father moved off, started a new life, and he was left in the custody of his mother. His mom had to get a job to support the family, and so during the day, she would leave Ron in the care of relatives or babysitters. And Ron claimed that by the age of 5 years old, he was basically raising himself. He would be forced outside by his babysitters, and he would just be running the streets all alone. He said he would hang out in churches and various businesses just to stay warm during the colder months. This was a very lonely existence for Ron. And then his mom was diagnosed with cancer, and she passed away not long after being diagnosed. So he was put into the custody of the state, and he was sent to an orphanage where he would live out the rest of his childhood. Ron claimed that he was relentlessly bullied and beaten by the other kids at the orphanage. The older kids would drag him into the woods and tie him to trees and just leave him there for hours. They would make fun of him for crying about his mother's death, and so Ron would have to run into the woods to cry so no one would see him, and if they did see him, they would beat him up. The older boys also attempted to sexually abuse Ron as well, and if he refused, he would be beaten. His father and grandmother would come visit occasionally, and Ron would beg them to take him home just to get him out of that place, but they just didn't want him. He remained at the orphanage for the remainder of his childhood until he was 16. And when he was 16, he left, and he ended up just moving from one relative's house to the next until he graduated high school, and then after high school, he joined the military. And it was in the military that Ron claimed to have had his big religious awakening. One day, he and some of the other guys were set to leave out for a visit back home, but at the last minute, Ron was told that he couldn't go because he hadn't completed some assignment. The other guys boarded the bus, they left, and on their way out, they got into a terrible car accident and everyone died. And Ron took this as a sign that he had been saved for some reason. He must be special. God must have saved him for some grand purpose. And from that day on, he completely threw himself into worshiping God. And now he spent his days traveling all around with his wife and kids, spreading the word and working as God's servant. And all it took was that one lunch date, and Ron knew that this was a family that he could manipulate and control and take advantage of. Because after that first day, Ron was always showing up at Mary's house. And this is when he really started planting the seeds, laying the foundation of what would go on to be the cult. He told Mary that he had a special connection with God, and God spoke to him. And God had placed him in Mary and Doug's life to help guide them spiritually to make them better Christians. And unfortunately, this worked on Mary because all she ever wanted to do was be a good Christian. She thought that Ron could help Doug become more like him, more knowledgeable and more faithful. Now, Doug was not around most of the time when Ron was there talking about all of this stuff. He was at school all day. He'd come home for a few hours to eat, take a nap, and then it was off to work. And so Mary was really the one dealing with Ron most of the time when he would just randomly stop by. And Ron knew that if he could manipulate Mary into following him, Doug would follow as well. And unfortunately, that is what happened. Ron started coming over all the time now, and usually he had his entire family with him. And I can't remember if I mentioned this or not, but Ron and Dorothy have 6 kids at this point, but they go on to have 12. And Mary and Doug were now feeding their family and the Larrinaga family because they were over so often. And Ron never offered to help or pitch in for groceries, and that's because Ron didn't work. He said that his full-time job was to be God's servant. So they never pitched in for food. Doug and Mary were footing the bill, and they barely had any money for themselves. So things go on like this for a while, and then the day finally came that Doug finished college. His hard work had paid off, and he now had his teaching degree, and he found a job working in a public school. However, when Ron found out that Doug was working in a public school, he was pretty upset, and he told Doug that he needed to quit that job because he was working with ungodly heathens. God wanted him to work only at religious schools. And just to put into perspective how much of a hold Ron already had over these people, Doug actually quit his job at the public school and found a job teaching religious classes. Ron had taken over Mary's family. He became their full-time, practically live-in spiritual advisor, and he started making all of these big life-changing decisions for their family. Eventually, Mary and Doug started to pull away from their extended families. Mary's parents couldn't stand Ron, and they could see this person for who he actually was. They knew that he was just taking advantage of Mary and Doug. Mary's parents pleaded with her to distance herself from Ron because he was leading her down this really weird, potentially dangerous path. Her father said that he knew something bad was going to happen if she continued to follow this man. But Ron would be in Mary and Doug's ear, telling them that their families were following Satan and not to listen to them because they were going to drag them down with them. And so over time, Mary and Doug started to see their families less and less. Ron is slowly isolating them, making it easier for them to control. And then one day, Ron decided that they were all going to just pack up and move to Arizona. His plan was that they would make this move together and he and Doug would enroll in a Bible college together. And this is when things get so much worse because once Ron has everyone isolated, he really starts to show his true colors. We can already see that he's manipulative and controlling, but he has yet to fully take the mask off in front of Mary and Doug. But that was all about to change. So against the advice of their extended families, Mary and Doug agreed to uproot their entire lives and move to Phoenix, Arizona. They rented out a duplex, and so Mary and Doug and their kids lived in one side of the duplex, and then Ron and his family lived on the other side. So they were right next door to each other, which meant that they were always together. Doug, again, was the only one who worked outside of the home, and so he was fully supporting his family and Ron's family. He and Ron did attend Bible school together during the day, and Doug went to work at the post office there in Phoenix at night, the same situation that he had just gotten himself out of back in California. And of course, Ron only lasted a few weeks at the Bible school before he quit because he knew more than all of the other teachers. And so now he was back to being at home all the time. And like I said, this is when Ron's true colors started to show. First of all, Ron was now being very mean and condescending towards Doug and Mary, but especially Mary. He was constantly telling them that they weren't good Christians, they weren't worshiping the way they should. Ron also demanded that his wife wait on him hand and foot, and Mary and Doug were starting to see how abusive he was towards her. She did everything for him. She even dressed him and put his shoes on his feet. All he had to do was say the word, and Dorothy was right there following orders. And Ron started berating Doug for not treating Mary the exact same way that he he treated Dorothy. He told Doug that he was weak because he didn't expect enough obedience from his wife. But Doug and Mary did not have this type of relationship. But now Ron, their spiritual leader, is telling them Doug really needs to be the boss around here. He needs to make Mary do everything and demand more from her and not let her talk back, and she needs to learn her place. And so Doug started demanding more from Mary. Ron was even bossing Mary around. Dorothy and Mary became like servants. They were waiting on the men hand and foot 24/7. And on top of that, Ron was now no longer trying to hide the extreme abuse of his children. Anyone could have guessed that Ron was abusing those kids, with the way they acted, so quiet and just out of it all the time. But the level of abuse that these children went through is horrific. All of Ron's kids, even down to the youngest, who was only 15 months old, were essentially tortured by Ron on a daily basis. He would create these made-up scenarios in his head, and he would punish his children for it. They were not allowed to be kids. They were expected to just be little mindless robots. At school, they weren't allowed to play with the other kids at recess. They weren't allowed to sit with anyone at lunch. Ron didn't want them associated with heathens. And so every day when the kids got home from school, they would be interrogated by Ron. He would have the kids line up, and one by one, they would each have to walk them through their entire day. Who did they talk to? What did your teacher say? Did you play with anyone at recess? And if that child said one thing that Ron didn't like for whatever reason, or if he thought that they were lying to him, they would be severely punished. The kids were even told to spy on one another, making it pretty much impossible for them to trust each other. And this would keep them from forming any close bonds or confiding in each other, which is what Ron wanted. It's heartbreaking to think about because their home lives were so incredibly abusive and miserable, and going to school was probably something that they actually looked forward to because they felt safe. That should have been a place for them to actually be kids and play with other kids and laugh and talk with other kids. But instead, their father, their tormentor, has ruined that for them as well. And these punishments were so extreme. Ron would beat the children himself, but most of the time he would order someone else to do it for him. He would order Dorothy to beat the kids if they even made a noise while he was preaching, even a cough or a sneeze. And this man never shuts up, so these kids had to be quiet pretty much all the time. They would be hit with wooden spoons, hairbrushes, and belts. The belt that Ron used the most was one that he had cut into strips at one end. It was a DIY cat o' nine tails, and it caused excruciating pain. The kids would be taken to the bedroom and stripped down naked. They would be whipped until they were bruised and bloody. And then Ron would call the other kids into the room and make them look at what he had just done. They would be publicly humiliated in front of everyone. Other times, the punishments would be starvation. The kids would have food and water completely withheld from them for however long Ron felt was appropriate. He would sometimes force them to stand in one spot with their hands behind their backs, just staring at a wall for hours. And I'm talking like 12 hours at a time, sometimes more. He would also lock the children inside of rooms or closets for very long stretches of time, and they would be forced to stay there and repent for whatever they had done, which was probably nothing. These punishments would be inflicted on his wife Dorothy as well if she even dared to mumble one word out of line. The first time Mary and Doug witnessed the abuse was during a Bible study one night. Ron and Dorothy's youngest at the time was only 15 months old, and she was sitting in a high chair. And Ron had been blathering on and on for a while, and the baby was getting restless, and so she started to fuss. And if Ron was speaking, he expected zero noise whatsoever, and this went for the babies as well. So the baby started to fuss, and Ron told Dorothy to take her to the back and punish her. Dorothy snatched her up, brought her into a room, and beat her with a hairbrush. She then brought the baby back out and put her back in her high chair, and when she started whining again, Dorothy just repeated the same process until finally she stopped crying. And she just sat quiet and broken in her little high chair. Now Mary and Doug knew why the kids were so well behaved. They had been beaten into submission starting from birth. But Ron was by far the hardest on his oldest daughter, June. Ron targeted June for some reason. He claimed that he saw the devil in her and there was just no saving her, and so June was constantly on Ron's bad side. Now, Mary and Doug were both really uncomfortable with the way that Ron treated his family, but they were pretty much brainwashed by this point. And so when Ron said that he beat his children so they would become good, obedient Christians, they believed him. Now, perhaps as a way to isolate his wife and kids even further, Ron decided to move his family to a remote area right outside of Phoenix. There was a lot of bad stuff happening in that duplex in Phoenix, and so Ron was probably worried that the neighbors would hear. So they rented a house outside of town, and it was much more secluded. Mary and Doug were still supporting Ron's family, though. They were still providing money and groceries for them, and they were barely scraping by. But then one day, Ron found out that Doug had to deliver mail to a bar that was on his route. He talked Doug into quitting his job. And now that Doug was no longer working, all the money and the food that Mary and Doug had been providing for the group slowed way down. And this is when Ron invited Mary and Doug to move in with them. This would be the first time that they were all actually living under one roof. And I believe that Ron forced Doug to quit his job because he knew that if Doug lost his job, it would be easier to talk him and Mary into moving in with them. And then everyone would be under one roof, and Ron could control them all much easier. And with that many people living under one roof, food and money ran out very quickly. By this time, Mary and Doug had 3 kids, and Ron and Dorothy had like 7 or 8, and Dorothy was pregnant again. And the situation got pretty dire. There was no food at all in the house. Everyone was so hungry. They were in physical pain. The kids were constantly crying. They were totally miserable. And Mary begged Ron to let Doug go get his job back, or at least let them go to a food bank to get some food for the kids. But Ron wouldn't allow it. All he would say is that God would provide and you just have to have faith. Meanwhile, the children are literally starving to death. And this went on for weeks. Keep in mind that Dorothy is pregnant and she is not eating. She was so frail and weak, she ended up actually going into premature labor, possibly from all the stress and lack of food. Thankfully, the baby was okay, and while Dorothy was in the hospital, she was getting fed 3 meals a day, something that she was not used to. And so Ron started going up to the hospital and taking portions of Dorothy's hospital food, and he would send it back to the house for the rest of the group to eat. But once Dorothy was out of the hospital, that small amount of food that they had was gone. And once again, everyone was starving. Ron would beat his children for complaining about being hungry because they weren't trusting in God's plan. Good, obedient Christian kids didn't whine or complain. And this was the thing that broke Mary. She just could not take it anymore. She couldn't just sit in that miserable house and watch those children slowly die of hunger. One day she just completely lost it and she laid into Ron and she was yelling at him to let them go to a food pantry. You know, this is crazy. We're all just slowly dying. And this actually worked. Ron actually listened and he broke down and allowed them to go to a food pantry to get some food. Ron and Doug went out and got the food, and Mary and Dorothy prepared a meal, the first hot meal that they had had in weeks, maybe months at this point. And once they had been fed, Ron was now angry at Mary for freaking out. He said that she was ungrateful. She wasn't a true believer because she didn't trust that, they would be provided for. Ron was really good at making Mary and Doug believe that they were just evil. And things just progressively got worse from there. There was still not enough food to go around. The food pantry helped, but it wasn't enough for all the mouths they had to feed. And Ron also started trying to force Mary and Doug to discipline their children the way that he disciplined his. He wanted them to beat their children into submission. This situation just kind of snapped them out of their trance, momentarily at least, and Mary and Doug decided that it was just best if they moved out. This was all just getting way too out of hand. She and Doug ended up taking their kids back to California and putting their lives back together. They reconnected with their families. They bought a little house with the help of Mary's parents, and Doug found a job at a public school where he taught science. Their kids were happy. They had friends. They were thriving, and life was really good. Things were finally back to normal. And you would think that Mary and Doug would have learned their lesson and stayed far, far away from Ron Larrinaga. But no. For some unknown reason, Doug reached out to Ron. Doug wrote Ron a letter, basically just telling him how life was going. He told him where he was working, just kind of catching him up. And that letter was all Ron needed because now he knew where to find Mary and Doug and he could worm his way right back into their lives. And that's exactly what happened. Doug gets a call out of the blue while he's at work one day, and it was none other than Ron Larrinaga asking him if he and his family could come stay with them for a few days while they were passing through California. He said that he and his family were going on the road to do missionary work and they just needed a place to stay for a couple of days. Now, Mary and Doug were not comfortable with the idea of Ron staying with them after the nightmare that they lived a couple of years earlier, but because of their religious beliefs, they felt like they couldn't turn their backs on someone in need, and so unfortunately they agreed to let Ron and his family stay, but they said only for a few days. However, Ron and his family ended up staying for much longer than just a few days. In fact, they moved in, and Ron made himself right at home. He walked in like he owned the place, immediately making demands of Mary and Doug, and literally within days of Ron arriving, he was right back to controlling their every move. I don't understand how this man was able to do this after what he had put them through back in Arizona. By this time, Dorothy and Ron had even more children, so there were now a ton of people living in this tiny house. But Mary and Doug noticed that Ron's daughter June was not with them, and this worried them because remember, June was the daughter that Ron treated the worst, the one that he claimed was possessed. The last time Mary and Doug had seen June, she was super skinny, she was so beaten down, and they were worried that something really bad might have happened to her. But no one would talk about June. It was like she never even existed. What Ron wasn't telling them is that one day June didn't come home after school. The teachers at June's school back in Arizona found out about the abuse, and they had reported Ron to social services, and June had been put into foster care. And when Child Protective Services started to come by Ron's house to ask questions, he got spooked and he packed up and just left Arizona and abandoned June there. So they were not actually headed out on a mission trip. Ron had left Arizona to avoid prosecution. He was on the run. And when Mary's parents found out that Ron was back in their lives, controlling them again, and living rent-free in the house that they had helped Mary and Doug get, they were heartbroken and they were furious. They'd already lost their daughter and grandkids to Ron once, and they could feel that it was happening again. Ron once again completely alienated them from their family and friends. And he also ordered Doug to quit his job at the public school, which Doug did. And just like clockwork, Ron again made the suggestion that they all move to a different state. This is literally history repeating itself. This time, though, Ron wanted to get as far away from California as he could, and so they decided to move to Florida. So Ron and the others moved in with another family called the Millers. These were people that Ron had met on a mission trip, and just like Mary and Doug, they had been brainwashed by Ron, and they too were under his control. They were Sam and Catherine Miller and their 18-year-old daughter, Kathleen. So now Ron and his huge family, Mary and Doug and their now 4 kids were all living permanently with the Millers. And this was the cult. Ron finally had all of his followers living under one roof. He was their leader. They all looked to him as their spiritual guide, and they believed that he was a prophet, that he was actually speaking to God. And as you probably guessed, things turned ugly real fast. Ron was no longer just abusing his own children. He also started beating on everyone else's kids and on all of the adults as well. He had a few people within the cult who he trusted to hand out the beatings for him. They were like his lieutenants in the cult, and that was his oldest son, Randall, and the Miller's daughter, Kathleen. And this was around the time that Mary became a target for Ron. Mary was the more outspoken one amongst the women. That was just her nature. She would challenge Ron at times, especially if she thought that he was being too hard on the kids. And he didn't like that because, women were supposed to just be quiet and they were just supposed to submit to whatever the man wanted and never question anything. One day, Mary got into trouble for something, and Ron threw her down on the bed. He pulled down her underwear, and he ordered Kathleen to whip her with a cat o' nine tails. Mary was whipped so severely, she had bruises and cuts all over her body. There was blood everywhere, and this became a common occurrence. Ron also started starving his followers. They would be locked inside of rooms for days, fed only small amounts of rice and water. Sometimes they got nothing at all. And this probably comes as no surprise, but Ron was also sexually abusing the children in the cult, including his own daughters. He would walk in on the girls while they were showering and he would stand and watch them. Sometimes he would put his hand into the shower and grope them. Ron did try to be discreet around the other adults, but he didn't care if the other children knew. In fact, he would do stuff to the girls in front of the other kids. This is how confident he was that those kids were terrified of him and they wouldn't go and tell. Doug and Mary had a little travel trailer, and Ron would take it out on the road occasionally to do missionary trips, and he would insist on taking some of the kids with him on the road, and he would do unspeakable things to the girls on these trips. And this was life for years. Doug was not around when most of the physical abuse took place because he was out working all day to support all of these people. But then Doug lost his job, and this caused a lot of tension between him and Ron. They started butting heads a bit, and Doug was challenging Ron more than usual. And because Doug was home more now, he was seeing more of the abuse. And finally, one day he'd had enough, and he said, "We're leaving," and he and Mary packed up their kids and they moved back to California. Again. They gave Ron their little travel trailer because Doug knew that it wouldn't be long before they all got evicted, with him no longer financially supporting them, and then they all parted ways. By 1972, Mary and Doug had settled back into their lives in California, but things were never really the same. They were just changed after their experience with Ron. They became very closed off. They didn't really have any friends, and they still didn't talk to their families very much. They had broken away from Ron and the cult, but they were still holding on to some of his extreme beliefs. But they were trying to make their lives as normal as possible for their children. But for some reason, Mary and Doug started corresponding with Ron. He would send them postcards from the various states that they were in. They were traveling all over the country. Ron did this to keep them at least somewhat in his life so he could eventually push his way back in when he needed to. Because one day, Ron and his family, which now consisted of himself, Dorothy, and 11 children, which remember they have 12 total, but June was no longer with them, and also the Miller family, they all showed up on Mary and Doug's doorstep, and they just moved right on in. Ron picked right back up where he'd left off in Florida, and in no time at all, he was running the show once again with everyone following his every command. Everything started up again: the beatings, the starvation, the sleep deprivation, the imprisonment, the sexual abuse of the children. It was all happening again. And I know you're probably thinking, like, why did they continue to let this happen? I don't think we have an answer to that question. Some people are just easier to manipulate, especially when it comes to religion. And I think that Mary was easily put under Ron's spell because he said all of the right things in the beginning. But now here they are, right back into this nightmare that they had managed to escape twice already. But this time it would be years before they could break free from Ron. And things got so much worse. Ron was quite literally torturing his family, Mary and Doug's family, and the Millers on a daily basis. In 1978, they moved to a remote area in Tujunga, California. Ron ordered that a tall fence be built around the house so the few neighbors that they did have couldn't see what they were doing. This house had an intercom system, and Ron would play loud religious music all throughout the house just to drown out the sounds of people's screams. There were also speakers outside of the house, and he would blast religious music, or sometimes he would even give these like crazy sermons over the speakers just to piss off the neighbors. And around this time, Ron started drinking heavily, and this only made the violence worse. And now he was starting to get super paranoid. He no longer allowed any of the kids to go to public school. Everyone had to do chores around the house, even the youngest kids. Since they weren't attending school, they would be forced to do work all day long: woodworking, gardening, yard work, cooking, cleaning, all while Ron did nothing. All he did was preach at everyone while they were working. And Ron had cameras installed all around the house so that he could see everyone's every move. These people were prisoners in that house. And Ron's punishments just got more sadistic. He once ordered Kathleen to take Mary into a bedroom, strip her down, and beat her with a belt. By the time this beating was done, there was blood everywhere. It was all over the room. And during this beating, Mary had lost control of her bladder and she urinated on herself. And when Ron saw what Mary had done, he forced her to put her urine-soaked underwear on her head and let her urine drip down into her eyes and all over her face. He then made all of the children come into the room and look at her and mock her. Mary's own children were forced to watch this happen to their mother. One of Mary's younger daughters had a weak bladder. She just always had a hard time holding it in, and sometimes she would have accidents. And so he would force her to stand in a corner and drink glass after glass of water. And she would be expected to stand there and hold her bladder. She would be crying and jumping around, desperately trying to hold it in because she knew what would happen if she didn't. But every time, without fail, she would eventually wet herself. And every time, without fail, she would be severely punished for it. Every time I cover a case like this where the parents are just watching their kids being tortured by these cult leaders, I get so frustrated with the parents because those kids are there because of them. Mary and Doug continued to let Ron back into their lives over and over again. And because of their horrible, stupid choices, their kids are now suffering. There were times that Mary did try to speak up and protect the children, but she would always be punished for it. One day, her daughter was once again being forced to hold her pee in, and she couldn't, and so she was beaten, and Mary just kind of snapped, and she did intervene. And as punishment for Mary questioning him, Ron made all the kids pee in a toilet, and then he grabbed Mary by the hair and dunked her head into the toilet and held her there while the kids were watching. Ron had a knack for coming up with these really cruel and humiliating, weird punishments like this. He was sadistic. So this house that they were living in, it was a split-level home, and this made it easier for Ron to isolate certain people. He would just banish them to one part of the house sometimes for months at a time. and there were times where one or more of the children would be sent to one side of the house and locked in a closet for months. So there were times that Mary didn't see her children for very long stretches of time. Doug was really the only person in the cult who Ron didn't physically assault. He did control his every move, and he psychologically abused him. Every bit of money that Doug earned went directly into Ron's hands. Ron also started interrogating Doug after work, just like he had done with his kids. Doug would have to walk Ron through his entire day, and he would be punished if he did anything that Ron thought was ungodly. Doug would be sent to a room alone, and eventually he was being constantly isolated from the rest of the group. Mary and Doug were no longer allowed to sleep in the same room, and they were forbidden to have sex with each other. And after months of them being physically separated, Mary and Doug were practically strangers. There was a reason that Ron wanted to isolate Mary from Doug, because Ron wanted to have Mary for himself. One day, after an especially violent beating, Mary was ordered to go into the boys' bedroom and wait for Ron. Ron had sent the adults out of the house for the afternoon, and the younger kids were doing a Bible study with the older kids on the other side of the house. And now it was just Ron and Mary alone together. And Ron told her that he had a proposition for her. Ron was going to teach her the proper way to please a man, so when she was finally allowed to be with Doug again, she would know the proper way to pleasure him. And if she let Ron teach her without putting up a fight, she would get fed better. She wouldn't be beaten as often. She would have it a little easier than the others did. And if she refused, she would be beaten for disobeying God's orders. Mary knew that she had no choice but to comply. She was shaking all over because she knew what was about to happen to her. And during this assault, Ron actually had the nerve to get annoyed with Mary because her hip bones were sticking out so far that it was hurting him while he was assaulting her. Mary was skin and bones by this point because she was being starved by Ron, and he had the nerve to complain that she was hurting him. This was just the first of many times that Ron sexually assaulted Mary. And after that day, Mary was fed bigger portions, and she would be forced to eat every bite because Ron wanted her to put on a little weight. But because Mary wasn't used to eating large portions anymore, she would throw up after she ate, and then she would be punished for wasting God's bounty. Now, Doug had no clue what was going on between Mary and Ron because he worked all day, and like I said, he was being physically separated from her, and so he didn't see any warning signs. But Dorothy started to get suspicious that something was going on because Ron kept sending the adults out of the house to run errands every day, and he would always stay behind with Mary. And Dorothy eventually refused to go out, which is shocking that she actually refused to do something Ron told her to do. I'm sure she got punished for that. So Ron had to come up with some other way to assault Mary without anyone knowing. He started sending Mary into the backyard to water the plants in the evening. They had a big backyard and the plants were pretty far back, and under the cover of darkness, you couldn't really see anything back there. Mary was never let out of the house, so these trips to water the plants in the evenings was pretty much the only time she got to go out into the fresh air. But she knew that any happiness she was feeling would be short-lived because Ron would eventually walk outside and he would assault her right there in the backyard. And just keep in mind that Ron is also sexually assaulting the girls in the house as well, the young girls, including his own daughters. Ron even started assaulting Mary in front of her kids. Mary slept in the room with the boys in a bunk bed if she wasn't locked in a closet. And Ron would sneak into the bedroom and assault Mary with her kids right there in the same room. And sometimes they would see what was happening. But Ron didn't care. In fact, Mary said that she thinks Ron wanted the kids to see what he was doing to her. There were also times where Mary's kids would be in the same room and Ron would come in to assault her, and instead of letting the kid leave the room, he would tell them to just turn around and face the wall. And so that child would be forced to stay in the room while their mother was assaulted. Eventually, all Ron wanted was sex from Mary. It was a constant thing that she was forced to endure. Mary literally became Ron's sex slave. And because Doug was so isolated from the others, he didn't see what was happening. He and Mary were still technically married, but they never saw each other anymore. Mary was living her own version of this nightmare, and Doug was living his. As the kids in the cult started to grow up after years of living in this absolute hell, Ron started forcing some of Mary's older kids out. And in 1982, Ron ordered Mary's oldest son and daughter to join the military. This is her son Daniel and her daughter Cinda. And any money that Cinda and Daniel earned went straight into Ron's pockets. Daniel remained under Ron's control even after joining the military and, being away from everything. And after he was done serving his time in the Navy, he went home. But once Mary's daughter Cinda got away from Ron, his hold over her became less and less. She stopped sending her paychecks to him. She started doing things that she wanted to do, having a little freedom that she had been denied since she was a little girl. Cinda never went back home and she started living her own life. She got married, she had a baby, she had her own little family, and her parents weren't around to see what a great, successful person that she had grown up to be despite everything she had been through. Over time, more of Mary's kids were sent away, and Ron always made them promise that they would go out and get a job and send all the money back to him. One of her daughters was only 16 years old when she was kicked out and forced to navigate the world all alone with zero education or socialization. Eventually, only 3 of Mary's kids were left, her youngest 2, Ellen and Jimmy, and her oldest son, Daniel, who had returned from the Navy. And Ron didn't kick his own kids out, but some of them started running away. His oldest son, Randall, who had been one of his enforcers, he ran away, and another one of his older sons ran away after attempting to take his own life. And the fact that his children were choosing to leave absolutely enraged Ron. He would take that rage out on everyone else in the house. Now, as the years went on, Mary became even more isolated and withdrawn. Most of her children were gone by now. Her husband was a stranger to her by this point. She was kept locked in a closet most of her life. And if she wasn't locked up, she was being punished or sexually assaulted or being forced to be a servant. She was living in a total fog. At this point, Ron had been ruling over the Rich family for more than 20 years. This had all started back in 1961, and we are now in the mid-80s. But thankfully, this madness was about to come to an end. One day in 1986, Ron was arrested after a dispute with the neighbors got out of hand. And as his followers were watching him being handcuffed and loaded into a police car, they knew they had to intervene. They knew if they didn't try to step in and defend Ron, they would all be punished when he got out of jail. So they were all yelling and screaming at the officers. They even got in their cars and chased them to the police station. And because of this, they all ended up being arrested. They weren't held for long. They were pretty quickly released. But while they were in custody, Ron was acting like a giant toddler. He was lying on the floor of his jail cell, crying for help, crying that this wasn't fair, just making a massive scene and acting like a big baby. And I find that so ironic because Ron has spent the last 20 plus years imprisoning his followers, locking them in closets, keeping them inside away from the rest of the world, but now he's throwing a tantrum because now he's the one that's locked up. Now, when the arrest took place, Doug was at work at the time, so he wasn't involved. And when everyone was finally released and Doug found out what had happened, this was the breaking point for him. That was the day that he decided that he was done with Ron and he was done with the cult. Doug had actually been secretly corresponding with the children who had been kicked out of the cult, who were now on the outside. And Doug was starting to come to terms with the fact that Ron was a false prophet. He had kept them trapped and tortured for years, destroyed their family, ruined his kids' childhoods, and it was all a lie. Ron was not a prophet. He was just a lazy, sadistic, despicable human being, and Doug wanted him gone. So Doug's name was the one on the lease for this house. So Doug goes to Ron and he says, "You need to leave. I want you and your family out of my house." He would give Ron 3 days to pack up and leave, and if he didn't do it, he threatened to go to the police and tell them everything Ron had done to them for the last 2 decades. Ron did not try to argue. He said that he and his family would be gone within those 3 days, but Ron had no intentions of leaving his sex slave Mary behind. So that night, he went to Mary and he told her that Doug was possessed by a demon and that he was dangerous and that her and her remaining children, Ellen, Jimmy, and Daniel, needed to leave with him. So the next night, they waited for Doug to go to sleep, and Ron, Dorothy, and Mary loaded up the travel trailer with some belongings. And then the next morning, they waited for Doug to leave for work, and once he was gone, they loaded up the kids and they took off in the travel trailer. When Doug got home from work that evening, he realized what had happened. Mary had chosen Ron over him, and now his kids were gone as well, and he was devastated. The cult wandered around, hopping from state to state for 2 months. Finally, Ron decided that they would stop in Florida and find a place to live. Daniel got a job, and they rented a house in Palm Bay, and Ron just picked right back up where he had left off in California. He was right back to torturing everyone. The adults and the children were all being severely physically, psychologically, and sexually abused. Mary was being assaulted on a daily basis, beaten, locked in a closet for days, sometimes weeks on end, and life would continue like this for months. And Ron probably thought that he was safe now from Doug's threats of going to the police, but thankfully that was not the case. Doug had reconnected with not only his children who'd been kicked out of the cult, but also Ron's oldest son, Randall. And Randall absolutely loathed his father. And he and Doug had teamed up to track down Ron and bring him to justice. Mary's oldest daughter, Cinda, was also helping in the search, and they hired a private investigator to track Ron down. And thankfully, they managed to locate him in Florida. They decided that it would be best if they just showed up at Ron's house to take him by surprise. Doug, Cinda, and Randall arrive at the house. They bang on the door and they started yelling for Ron to come outside. And like the coward he is, Ron ran and hid, and he forced Mary to go out and handle it instead. And when Mary walked outside and came face to face with her daughter Cinda, who she hadn't seen in years at this point, she didn't even know who Cinda was at first. She kept thinking to herself that this woman looked very familiar, but she didn't know who she was. And they could not believe the state that Mary was in. She looked exhausted and pale and emaciated. And Doug immediately starts trying to talk some sense into Mary. He's saying, I've come to rescue you and the kids. You have to come with me. Ron has been molesting the girls. But nothing that he was saying was getting through to Mary. It was like her mind was just completely melted at this point. And Ron actually ended up calling the police and claiming that these people were just crazy and they were trespassing. His story was that he had rescued Mary and her kids from Doug back in California because he was extremely abusive and dangerous. And all the remaining cult members backed up everything Ron was saying. Doug must have been so angry in that moment because this man who had stolen decades from him, stole his family from him, had been sexually assaulting his kids and his wife. He's having to listen to that man spin it like he's the monster. So the police are just really confused. They thought that this was just like a simple trespassing call, and now they're hearing about a cult and allegations of abuse. So they went through and they got everyone's story, but they didn't know who was telling the truth. They had no real proof either way. The officers in the end just decided that they would report this all to Child Protective Services just to get an investigation started. But in the meantime, no one would be arrested. Everyone was allowed to remain in the house with Ron. Doug pleaded with the officers not to leave the kids there because Ron would run as soon as they left, but they didn't listen, which is unfortunate because that's exactly what Ron did. He didn't even wait until the next day. As soon as the officers left, Ron packed up his kids and Dorothy and they took off. But thankfully, this time he did leave Mary and her two youngest kids behind. He told Mary that he would go and get settled somewhere and then he would send for her later. I think he did this to get Doug off his back. He probably thought that if Mary and Doug's kids were not with him, that Doug would just leave him alone. But Ron told Mary that while he was out looking for a place to stay, she should focus on getting Doug arrested. He had Mary go down to file a false police report saying that Doug had been abusing her and the kids for years. But this completely backfired when Child Protective Services showed up to interview the children. Ellen and Jimmy were interviewed, and based on what they told the caseworker, they were removed from Mary's custody immediately and placed in state care. And although Mary was devastated, this would actually turn out to be the thing that finally opened her eyes about Ron. She was out from under Ron's authority for the first time in years. She didn't have to worry about being beaten or assaulted. She could eat when she wanted to. She finally had time to sleep and reflect on everything, and slowly she started to realize what Ron truly was. Ron called her a few months later to tell her that he had gotten settled and that she could come meet them if she wanted to, but she said no. She said she was not leaving Florida without Ellen and Jimmy, and they were still in state care. And now Mary was solely focused on getting her kids back. She got a job, she got her own apartment, she actually made a friend. She started wearing makeup and fixing her hair and dressing how she wanted to. She was finally getting her identity back. And eventually she was even granted visitation with her kids on the weekends. Mary was like a totally different person by this point, and she was finally ready to help bring Ron to justice. She contacted the state's attorney's office and she told them everything. So while all of this is going on with Mary, Doug and Randall had been searching for Ron, and the private investigator had managed to track Ron down in San Antonio, Texas. In November of 1989, 25 years after he had first walked into Mary and Doug's lives, Ron Larrinaga was finally arrested. He was charged with 42 counts of physical and sexual abuse, and Ron claimed that he did nothing wrong. He was simply a servant of the Lord, and this was all religious persecution. The trial went on for 4 weeks, and there were over 30 people testifying against Ron, including several of his own children and Mary. They even managed to track down June. Remember June from the very beginning of the video? She was taken from Ron and Dorothy when her teachers found out about the abuse, and Ron just left her in Arizona and went on the run. Well, they found her. She was still alive and well. She hadn't had the most stable life. She had been moved from foster home to foster home throughout her childhood, and she also testified at the trial. I bet Ron was pretty shocked to to see her sitting in the courtroom. Mary's oldest son, Daniel, also testified against Ron. It had taken him a very long time, but he finally realized what Ron truly was, and now he was helping to put him in prison for as long as possible. Ron brought a red leather Bible into the courtroom every day, and he would pretend to read through it while his victims were testifying. He rarely even looked up. He showed absolutely zero remorse or emotion. In the end, Ronald Joseph Larrinaga was found guilty on 42 counts, and he was sentenced to 180 years in prison. At the sentencing hearing, Ron said that he was a target of a nationwide conspiracy. He was being framed by law enforcement and satanic prosecutors, and he was the victim of political and religious persecution. He said, "I am not guilty of any of these charges. My conscience is blameless before God and man." He referred to his children as good virgin Christian girls, and he said that the Bible gave him the right to raise his children however he saw fit. And the children had obviously been coerced into testifying against him, and their souls have been destroyed. He also attempted to launch into a sermon, but the judge shut him up real quick. The judge said, "You're not being tried by the Almighty. You'll answer to him later." As far as I can tell, Ron is still alive, and he is serving his sentence at Florida's Marion Correctional Institution. Mary eventually reconnected with her father, but her mother had passed away years earlier from a car accident. Mary's sister had called her when this happened to tell her that her mother was in a coma and she needed to come see her in the hospital, but Ron would not allow her to go. And tragically, her mother never came out of that coma and she passed away. And Ron wouldn't even let Mary go to the funeral. Once Mary was no longer under Ron's control, she had a hard time coming to terms with the fact that she had missed out on time with her mother before she died. She wasn't with her in those final moments after the accident. She didn't get closure at the funeral, just one more thing that Ron had stolen from her. Dorothy divorced Ron, and she and her children were finally free from him. I don't have a good update other than that. Like I said in the beginning of the video, most of the victims have remained anonymous and they haven't spoken out publicly. I just hope that everyone has gone on to live life to the fullest. Those kids got dragged into something so twisted. Their childhoods were stolen from them and they deserve to live their lives in peace, and I just really hope that they are doing okay. And that is all I have on this case. Please let me know what you think about this one down in the comments. I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to have a lot of feelings about Mary and Doug and how they just kept letting Ron come back into their lives. Do you think that Mary and Doug should have been held accountable for some of what happened? And don't forget, you can get 40% off your first order with Trade when you go to drinktrade.com/summer or click the link in my description box. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.